I once lived next to a boy named Wilbur. He was 12 years old and always had his head wrapped in bandages, covering his entire face. Wilbur never left his house. Sometimes I'd see him looking out from his bedroom window on the top floor, watching the other kids play outside. His window had metal bars, making it impossible for him to climb out. We found a way to communicate, writing messages on pieces of paper and holding them up to the window. Wilbur could never hear me through the locked glass, but it worked when his parents weren't around. Wilbur said his parents were obsessed with science and chemistry. They spent most of their time in the basement, working tirelessly day and night. The only times they paused were to bring Wilbur his meals. They weren't neglectful, they were just consumed by their work. His parents told him he had to stay inside until his face healed. Apparently, Wilbur had slipped on one of their chemicals and fallen face first, injuring himself badly. They worried that the neighborhood kids would tease him if they saw his scars. I remember one day when a group of older kids threw rocks at his window, laughing and pointing at him as he watched from behind the glass. Wilbur said it wasn't the first time, but he'd gotten used to it. Despite everything, Wilbur was a great guy. He still is. I never went inside his house, but he loved showing me his comic book collection through the window. He had tons of them, from Marvel and DC to lesser-known series. He was a huge superhero fan, and even told me he felt like one. A normal person exposed to dangerous chemicals, transformed into a superhero. He once wrote on a piece of paper, pretending to strike a heroic pose. I showed him my action figures and video games, and he was amazed. Wilbur admitted he'd never played a video game in his life. His babysitter had taken them from him before he ever got the chance, and burned them right in front of him. Wilbur's babysitter, Miss Fitzgerald, was truly awful. He said she hated kids and had been tormenting him long before his accident. She was every kid's worst nightmare. Wilbur told me she had a history of cruel behavior, even with other kids. Once, she babysat a 4-year-old girl and subjected her to 7 hours of pure misery. She starved the child and surrounded her bed with bear traps. The parents never found out, because Miss Fitzgerald lied her way into their trust store for a paycheck. Miss Fitzgerald was a cruel, heartless woman. There was no other way to describe her, and yet she had been left to care for Wilbur. Though Wilbur was old enough to make many decisions on his own, his parents had hired this monster. They had to travel to Texas for a science convention, leaving him alone with her. One day, I tried writing a message about her to Wilbur, hoping to warn him or make him smile. But before I could show it to him, I saw Miss Fitzgerald yank him away from the window, her grip firm and unrelenting. That was the last I saw of Wilbur for the rest of the day. The next morning, I peered through my window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Someone was lying on the bed in his room. The bandages around their head told me it was Wilbur, but something was wrong. I banged on my window to get his attention. Slowly, he sat up, wiping tears from his face. His eyes were swollen from crying, and his body was covered in brucessa, sickly purple that made my stomach turn. He grabbed a piece of paper and began to write, his movements shaky and hesitant. When he pressed the note against the glass, my heart sank. Help me. The words were scrawled so frantically they were almost unreadable. Wilbur banged on the window with his free hand, desperate, his eyes wide with fear. Then she appeared, Miss Fitzgerald. She stormed into his room, her bulky frame looming over him. In one hand, she held a lemon, in the other, a pair of scissors. What happened next is something I'll never forget. Miss Fitzgerald grabbed Wilbur's head and held him down, ignoring his screams of terror. She used the scissors to cut away the bandages that had always covered his face, throwing them carelessly to the floor. What I saw underneath made me feel sick, my chest tightening with horror. Wilbur's face was destroyed. His skin was melted and raw, a dark red surface stretching across his head like molten cheese. Even one of his eyes looked burnt, its edges warped and scarred. The chemicals had done this to him, left him trapped in a body that must have been a source of endless pain. Miss Fitzgerald wasn't done. She sliced the lemon in half with the scissors and tossed the blades aside. Pinning Wilbur to the bed with one hand, she squeezed the lemon directly onto his face. The acid seeped into his wounds, into his eyes, burning him. His muffled screams echoed in my ears, filled with agony and desperation. I could see the pain etched into his face, his body writhing as she forced him to endure the torment. I wanted to help him, to stop her. All I could do was watch, frozen in horror. She squeezed the second lemon onto his face again, tormenting Wilbur with unbearable pain. I couldn't stand by any longer. I banged my fist against the window, a decision I instantly regretted. Miss Fitzgerald turned, her eyes locking onto mine. Panic surged through me as she shoved Wilbur down onto the bed, ignoring his screams of agony, and stormed out of the room. I knew what was coming. Heart pounding, I bolted from my bedroom and ran downstairs. The only thing working in my favor was that my parents didn't know about Wilbur or Miss Fitzgerald. They wouldn't be home from work for a while. I locked the front door, praying it would hold. My eyes darted around the room, searching frantically for the house phone. Then a thunderous bang rattled the door, followed by Miss Fitzgerald's voice, screaming and cursing. I spotted the phone on the coffee table by the couch. Grabbing it, I quickly dialed 911. Her shouts grew louder, her fists pounding the door relentlessly as I pleaded with the operator. My words spilled out in a frantic rush as I explained everything from Wilbur's injuries to Miss Fitzgerald's horrifying actions. The operator assured me help was on the way. Minutes later, flashing lights appeared outside, signaling the arrival of the police. My parents pulled into the driveway soon after, having been notified of the situation by the authorities. Their faces were pale with worry as they bombarded me with questions, even more than the police. I recounted everything, how I'd become friends with Wilbur, how his parents left him with that monster of a babysitter, and what she had done to him. About an hour later, an officer approached me, his expression grim. What he revealed shook me to my core. Wilbur's so-called parents weren't his parents at all. They had adopted him from an out-of-town orphanage, not out of love, but to use him for a twisted experiment. The move to Texas It was a cover to continue their illegal activities in secret. Miss Fitzgerald was part of it all. Wilbur wasn't their first victim. 38 children between the ages of 2 and 13 had vanished under similar circumstances. These orphans had been subjected to horrific experiments to test the limits of human endurance. How much pain a child could bear before death. Security cameras inside and outside the house provided undeniable evidence. Miss Fitzgerald was arrested for child cruelty and the deaths of numerous children. The authorities were still searching for the 2 scientists behind it all. Wilbur, scarred in every sense of the word, had been lying to protect himself. He was placed with a new, trusted family far away. And just like that, he was gone from my life. 20 years passed. One evening, I was sitting alone at a bar, nursing a drink, when a man approached me. "Remember me?" he asked, smiling warmly. It took me a moment, but then I recognized him. Wilbur. He looked nothing like the boy I once knew. His bandages were gone, replaced by smooth, healthy skin. His brown hair and sky-blue eyes were those of a man who had rebuilt himself from the ashes of his past. We talked for hours, catching up over a few drinks. Wilbur and I both knew that the nightmare was far behind us. The scientists and Miss Fitzgerald were likely still locked away, unable to harm anyone else. But I couldn't shake one thought. If I hadn't called for help that day, the man sitting beside me would have been just another victim. Instead, he was Hera, survivor, a friend, and a reminder of the strength it takes to fight back against evil.